There's a longer 20-year arc around the relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Hamas, which, using a word that we oftentimes talk about in different contexts, almost seems like they are inextricably linked. Prime Minister Netanyahu rose to power in 1994, 1995 as the violent opponent to the peace process, most trenchant critic of Prime Minister Rabin before he was assassinated, and then ultimately rose to power immediately in the aftermath. Perez was in power for a little while, and then Netanyahu took over. What the kind of driver of Israelis against the peace process was the rise of terror that came from Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other sources. In other words, opposition to the peace process was facilitated both by the Israeli right, which Netanyahu became the head of, as well as by Hamas and Palestinian terror. They set themselves up as both ends that squeeze the moderate center from having any plausibility structure to govern effectively between Israelis and Palestinians. Then you watch a 20-year period of time where it becomes vital to Prime Minister Netanyahu's strategy to stall the peace process, to keep Hamas in power in Gaza and keep the Palestinian Authority Fatah in power in the West Bank. It almost feels as though, here's my thought experiment, it is necessary for Prime Minister Netanyahu to govern the state of Israel the way he wants to govern it, to actually ensure there's a perpetual war against Hamas, because to defeat Hamas would put him in a position of have to empower effectively Palestinian moderates and have to confront the inevitability of negotiating a different outcome from the present. Is that a crazy theory?
I think there are a few data points that support it. So there is the now infamous comment that the prime minister made to a Likud party meeting a few years ago, before October 7th, where he said that it is important Israeli policy to keep the Palestinian Authority in place in a weakened state in the West Bank and Hamas in place in a weakened state in Gaza. Because as long as you have Gaza and the West Bank being governed by separate entities, then there's no pressure on Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians over a peace process. And that is very clearly a policy he pursued. We're speaking in the wake of big events in Qatar this week. The prime minister's policy was to have the Qataris give Hamas $30 million a month for years. That was facilitated by Israel in all sorts of ways, which kept them where they were. And I think that fed into this strategy of making sure that they would stay in place in what he thought was a relatively weakened state, because I certainly don't think he wanted to empower them to a large degree, but he clearly understood the benefits of having them there. And post October 7th, what we're seeing is an interesting corollary or an interesting flip to this policy, which is that you're never going to catch Prime Minister Netanyahu now saying anything along the lines of Hamas having to be in place. And I'm sure he actually, I take him at his word. I don't think he actually, does want to keep Hamas in place at the moment. But what he's come up with as a formula, and this is now one of Israel's 5 official conditions for ending the war, is this idea that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are the same. They're no different. And he says that because he can no longer say, well, we should have one here and one there. But because he can no longer say that we should have Hamas in Gaza, he therefore then has to say, we also can't have the PA anywhere else either, because then it's on someone else to come up with a different entity that doesn't exist. Palestinian politics is a 2-party system. You have to, if you don't want to deal with Hamas, you got to deal with the other guys. And so this is what he's come up with. And I think it does feed into this idea that if he were to ultimately defeat Hamas, something that I would love to see happen, he would be left with this political bind. And so now he has decided that the Palestinian Authority, which without question is deeply problematic in all sorts of ways, is now as treif as Hamas. It allows him to preserve this overall theory of the case. And at some point, this shell game will have to end. It isn't possible for Israel to continue along this vein. And I worry that this new socialization of this idea, Hamas, terrible. They cannot be left in place. And the PA is just as bad, no difference at all. It's going to lead Israel into a hole that is impossible to climb out of.